have just noticed that I've been sitting holding my microphone for the last 40 minutes, and it turns out that it was actually my MacBook recording that microphone that picked up the recording. So I apologise, but with the effort that it's taken me to be able to record this episode, I am not going to do it again because my hand is actually sore from holding my microphone. So other than the video you've just seen and this post-recording Becca, apologies. It will be better in a few weeks, I promise, but I'm just trying to find a way to make things work. Before we dive in, I want to give a content warning. In this episode, I will be touching on themes surrounding addiction, emotional neglect, and the difficult choices that come with family relationships. If you have listened to past episodes, you might remember I spoke about my experience growing up with a parent who struggled with alcoholism. That episode was incredibly difficult to record, but I'm proud that I did it. Talking about addiction is something that still carries a lot of stigma and can feel incredibly lonely, and sharing that part of my story did take a lot of strength, but it also helped me to begin reflecting more deeply on how emotional maturity, or the lack of it, plays a role in these dynamics, and that's what I want to explore more in today's episode. Over the past year, especially through compassion-focused therapy, I have done a lot of healing work, and it has helped me to recognise how the trauma I experienced growing up shaped the way I see relationships, trust, and even myself. One of the most difficult decisions I've made recently was going low contact and eventually no contact with the only parent left I had in my life. That wasn't something I ever wanted, but when I started truly recognising the emotional immaturity that was present in that relationship, it reframed so much of my past. It even helped me better understand what happened with my mum. Healing is not linear, and even when you think you've processed something, new layers can appear and make you reevaluate everything all over again. I do want this episode to kind of be conversation, one that feels validating, educational, and honest. I'll be sharing some general definitions and examples, but also weaving in personal insights where it feels okay to do so. My goal is not to attack or blame, but to explore this with curiosity and care. And hopefully by the end of this episode, if you're someone who grew up around emotional immaturity, you might feel a little less alone, even if the experience has felt incredibly isolating at times. Before I get into this episode, please consider liking or subscribing if you like this content, and hopefully in the future you will be back to seeing more of my pretty face on episodes. Just right now, speaking feels easier without recording and having that element of editing, so I hope you can understand that in the meantime. I am still going to structure this episode in a way where it has chapters so that it is easy to find different parts, especially if you want to listen to it in a few sittings or if you just want to listen to specific parts. Firstly, I am going to start off with thinking about what is emotional immaturity. Let's start with a basic definition. Emotional immaturity is when someone struggles to manage and express their emotions in an appropriate and balanced way. It often shows up as self-centered behaviour and an inability to handle stress or conflict, or an unwillingness to take responsibility for their actions. Sometimes it is loud and dramatic, but often it is quiet and persistent, a pattern of avoidance, denial, and emotional disconnection. In the context of parenting, emotional immaturity can show up in a number of ways. It might look like a parent who is consistently dismissing or invalidating their child's feelings, even when the child is clearly upset or overwhelmed. It can be the kind of overreaction to minor challenges, turning something small into a full-blown crisis because they lack the tools to regulate their own stress. Sometimes emotionally immature parents blame others, often their own children, for their emotional responses, essentially saying, "Look at what you've made me do," instead of taking accountability. They might rely on their children to meet their emotional needs rather than offering the support the other way around, creating a dynamic where the child feels like the parent. When things get emotionally intense, they may shut down entirely or avoid hard conversations altogether, leaving the child confused and unheard. And perhaps one of the hardest things is that they often struggle to apologise in any meaningful way, if they do apologise at all. If they do, it's often deflective, like, "I'm sorry you felt that way," rather than, "I'm sorry that what I did hurt you." And the thing is, Kids usually internalise this. When you're constantly told, either directly or indirectly, that your feelings are too big, too much, or just plain wrong, you don't usually think, wow, my parent is emotionally immature. Instead, you think, what is wrong with me? And that belief sinks deep and really shapes how you relate to others and also yourself well into adulthood. In fact, researchers have highlighted that emotional invalidation from caregivers is linked to long-term mental health struggles, including poor emotional regulation, low self-esteem, and persistent self-blame. And when you consider that emotionally immature parents were usually raised by emotionally immature parents themselves, it does really start to highlight how cyclical this all is. They might have never had a model of what emotional safety or accountability actually looked like. Generational trauma doesn't always show up as big, obvious abuse. It can show up as chronic emotional absence, inconsistency, or the belief that emotion should be hidden or punished. And unless someone breaks that cycle, that dynamic just keeps repeating, silently teaching the next generation that love is conditional or that being emotionally vulnerable is not safe. And following on from that, it is worth saying sometimes emotional immaturity is loud and dramatic. It's the shouting over small disagreements, the slamming of doors, the passive aggressive silent treatment that stretches for days. It can look like explosive anger at things that don't warrant it, or dramatic mood swings that leave the people around them walking on eggshells. It can also look like intense guilt tripping or emotionally charged manipulation that keeps others feeling responsible for their mood. But it isn't always like that. Like I'd mentioned, sometimes emotional immaturity is subtle. It's the parent who never comforts their child after something upsetting, or who jokes about their feelings instead of actually acknowledging them. It can be seen in how they relate to others outside of the family too. Maybe they always need to play the victim. Maybe they're the person who avoids taking accountability in friendships or work environments. They may show poor impulse control, act defensive when questioned, or constantly need others to soothe their ego. Some real life examples can include things like road rage, blaming other drivers for everything that goes wrong, even when they were clearly the one at fault, or being the type of person who storms off in an argument and never returns to the conversation because emotionally they never learned how to stay present in conflict. And part of that is because they were never taught how to apologise in a meaningful way. I remember trying to explain that I'm sorry you feel that way isn't really an apology. It doesn't acknowledge any responsibility or validate the person's pain. I tried to offer some resources and examples that might help who I was talking to see what a real apology might look like, hoping that we could meet in the middle. But instead, I was told that they didn't need extracts from a book about how to apologise, even though that's exactly what the conversation felt like it needed to move forward. And like I said, I'm not saying this to blame, but to highlight something I've come to understand. When someone has never been taught emotional accountability, they often experience it as an attack rather than an opportunity for connection or growth. This isn't just about parent-child relationships either. These same patterns can show up in friendships, in work dynamics, in romantic relationships. Once you recognise what is missing, it becomes a little bit easier to stop internalising the lack of repair as your fault. It might be someone who holds grudges for years over small misunderstandings but refuses to actually talk about their own role in what went wrong. Or someone who expects their child to provide comfort during emotional breakdowns but doesn't have the capacity to comfort their child in return. For some of us, emotional immaturity in parenting showed up through addiction, and that creates a whole other dynamic, often leading to what is called parentification, where the child ends up taking care of the parent emotionally and sometimes even physically. This was definitely a part of my experience, and part of that for me meant learning how to monitor the emotional temperature of the house with extreme precision, knowing someone's mood from the sound of their footsteps, the way they breathed or huffed, or recognising the kind of movements that might signal alcohol, anxiety, or anger were involved. It meant tiptoeing through the day, trying to manage everyone's emotions in the hope that it might prevent any DV scene from erupting. I remember sometimes just hearing the back door shut in a certain way, voices rising, and knowing the only thing I could do was shut myself away in my room and play music loud enough to drown it out. I remember having a friend over for a rare sleepover, something that I didn't really do often. Usually I was either at my dad's at the weekend or too worried about what might happen if someone saw what things were really like. That night, my mum got drunk, and I was probably only in first or second year at school, so around 11 or 12 years old. My friend's mum had come to pick her up early because I had to take my mum to hospital after she cut her hand trying to get alcohol from the bottom drawer. The drawer knob had broken off and there was an exposed nail. I remember hearing a thud, her shouting out, and when I ran into the room, I saw the pool of blood around her hand. I don't remember how we got to the hospital, but I do remember sitting quietly whilst the nurse stitched her up and no one looked twice at me being there. I realised that I was the one kind of making the decisions. I was the one having to act like an adult when I was still a child. I used to think being told that I was mature for my age or being an old soul was a compliment. However, now when I hear that about kids, it really does genuinely break my heart, because why should a child have to be emotionally mature when all they should be doing is being a child? Growing up far too soon and ending up becoming an adult in the relationship long before your brain and body are ready for that kind of responsibility. It can affect your ability to trust others, to rely on people, or to feel safe expressing your emotional needs because you were the one that was always making space for someone else. And when I try to look back and understand the emotional dynamics of my mum's house, I do question what was emotional immaturity and what was a survival technique. Because when you're in a situation like that, being emotionally shut down can be a safety mechanism. But then there's this thought that circles in my brain that surely at some point that survival instinct becomes leaving, right? Like, I want to say this compassionately because I do know how complex, layered, and dangerous domestic violence situations are. But as a child who had to live in that environment, I struggle to understand why I wasn't protected. And maybe I never will. It's something I've come back to again and again, the gap between what children need and what they get, and how that gap truly shapes us. And when you grow up around it, it does shape everything. But if you're struggling to really take a close look at your relationship, it can sometimes help to notice how emotional immaturity shows up in other areas of the person's life too. Maybe they constantly play the victim with friends or at work, or avoid difficult conversations altogether, not just once or twice, but it's a pattern. Maybe they dodge accountability when something goes wrong on the job or refuse to resolve interpersonal tension maturely. Instead, they pretend like nothing ever happened. You might notice them bringing the same energy into social situations, being unable to apologise sincerely, making everything about them, or shutting down when challenged even slightly. Maybe they lash out when things don't go their way, or seem emotionally stuck in a much younger mindset. Their behaviour might remind you more of a reactive teen than a parent who's supposed to model stability and care. And when you start seeing those patterns clearly, it makes it harder to keep holding on to the version that you created in childhood, the one that you needed them to be. It can bring grief, clarity, and an unsettling kind of freedom all at once. As kids, we often see our parents as heroes. I know I did. I actually remember writing an essay in standard grade English about how my dad was my hero. He was motivational, he had worked his way up in his career, and I really admired that determination. And it made me believe that I could do it too. But at the same time, I also felt inadequate in ways that I couldn't ever explain. And that never really made sense to me until I was much older and began to understand that some parents know how to reduce their children to tears with just a look. That can be written off as being stern or strict, but why does it have to come with such an intense emotional reaction from a child? Why is fear considered respect when it comes to parenting? That realisation reframed so many memories. Suddenly, things that had always felt confusing kinda started to click into place. It wasn't me being overly sensitive. There was an emotional dynamic at play that I had never been able to name before. I'd already gone through the process of going low contact and eventually no contact with my mum. It was messy, it was back and forth, and there were moments where I just wanted to share something with her or for her to be proud of me. And I think that is such a common feeling, to want your parents to be proud of you. One of the first times I tried to go no contact with my mum, one of my best friends from high school died just a few days later, and the first thing I did, instinctively, was to call my mum in tears, because who else are you meant to turn to in a moment like that? That call, a lift in the back of our van from the train station to the crematorium, and a hug at the end of the service was the extent of the emotional support I received from her. And God, that was such a hard day, a hard week, a hard month, to be honest. You never expect one of your childhood best friends, the person that you were just laughing with 6 months earlier, would be forever 19. So I thought, having gone through that pain once, that I'd have the tools to make it work with my other parent, and I really did believe that we could repair the relationship instead of walking away. But the truth is, no matter how much you grow, if someone doesn't have the emotional capacity to understand you, it is always going to feel like you're speaking a different language. I just wanted to be understood, to be loved for who I am. And I got to 27 before I realised how much internalised shame and guilt that I had been carrying for my entire life, and that maybe it wasn't all my fault after all. And it's really not easy to unlearn the belief that your worth is tied to keeping other people comfortable, especially when those people were supposed to care for and protect you. What I want to go on to talk about next is the emotional context and the impact that this can have on adult life. I think it's important to not just talk about this from my perspective, but also to shine a light on how common these experiences are, because sometimes when you're in it, when you're trying to heal or unpack your own story, it can feel like you're the only one experiencing this. Like something must be wrong with you for you to be struggling so much, and I want you to know that that is not the case. Research actually shows that emotional immaturity in adults is more common than you might think. One study involving health science students found that over 63% of them had low to average levels of emotional maturity, and that is a huge number, and it just goes to show that we're not all being raised in emotionally healthy environments. And the thing is, emotional immaturity doesn't just stay in childhood. It follows you, it ripples into adulthood, into your relationships, your job, your mental health. A lot of people who have been raised by emotionally immature parents talk about struggling with vulnerability. It becomes hard to know how to express what you need because you spent so long shutting down or being told that your feelings were too much. There's often this overwhelming pressure to appear fine all the time, even when it feels like you're drowning. And there is also the parentification element, where kids end up taking on adult responsibilities way too early. They aren't just expected to help out around the house, or often expected to carry the emotional weight of the whole family. They become emotional caretakers for their parents, learning how to comfort others before they've actually learned to comfort themselves. And that seriously messes with your development. You grow up thinking that your needs are inconvenient, or worse, dangerous. You learn to put everyone else first because that is how you survived, how you kept the peace. And then as an adult, you might find yourself completely burnt out, running on fumes and unable to ask for help, yet still repeating those patterns without even realising it. And I think what is more heartbreaking is how common this really is. Research has shown that emotional immaturity in caregivers can lead to long-term impacts on their children's mental health. Emotional invalidation, being told your feelings are too much or that you're just being dramatic, can leave deep, deep scars. It has been linked to difficulties with emotional regulation, low self-esteem, and chronic self-blame, and we internalise it without even knowing that we're doing it. And the thing is, most emotionally immature parents were raised by emotionally immature parents themselves. They didn't get a model for what healthy emotional connections looked like. They were probably told to toughen up, to stop crying, to deal with things on their own, and so the cycle repeats. Generational trauma doesn't always look like physical abuse. It can be silent, it can be a lack of comfort, it can be being praised for your independence as a kid when really no one ever gave you the space to lean on them, when in reality you didn't need to be independent. All you needed was to be loved and supported to be able to flourish as a child. And unless someone in the family decides to do the uncomfortable work of breaking that cycle, it just keeps going, quietly shaping the way we love, communicate, and see ourselves for generations to come. It's not surprising that the research links these dynamics to things like anxiety, depression, and difficulties with boundaries in adult relationships. You grow up confused about what healthy even means. You either overfunction or try to control everything so you never get hurt again, or underfunction because it feels safer to shut down altogether. The next thing I want to think about is, has there been an increase in parental estrangement due to social media? There's even research now showing how many people are turning to books, podcasts, and platforms like TikTok to better understand these dynamics. One book that has become kind of a cult classic in these spaces is Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, and this has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. And it is actually a book that I have been listening to through my audiobook entitlement with my Spotify subscription. Don't get me wrong, there is a certain comfort in feeling seen and validated, but at the same time, learning more about how there was nothing I could have done to change the outcome is deeply heartbreaking. Not heartbreaking because my parents won't change, but heartbreaking for the younger me who truly believed that if she just tried harder, if she was just a better daughter, then maybe love wouldn't feel so conditional. Maybe if she just did everything right, she would finally be liked, not just loved by obligation, but liked for who she actually was. There have been so many times where I've sat with the painful realisation that while I do believe that my parents loved me in their own way, I've always had this lingering feeling that they didn't actually like me as a person. It was more about tolerating me because I was their child, and that belief didn't come from nowhere. It was built over years of repeated patterns, emotionally unavailable responses, and never really feeling like I was enough. That belief trickled into every relationship I've ever had. I've been cheated on, made to question my worth, and for the longest time, I thought all of that was my fault. It took a lot of compassion-focused therapy to begin to untangle that and to recognise that our emotional foundations come from the people who raise us. And when those people are emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, it can lead us to seek out relationships that mirror the same instability because it feels familiar, not safe, not secure, but familiar. That's not a coincidence, and I know there is a lot of people saying, yeah, that was my experience too. There is evidence suggesting that family estrangement is becoming more common, and social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube are playing a significant role in this trend. In the UK, the charity Stand Alone has reported that 1 in 5 families are affected by some kind of estrangement. In the United States, studies show that 27% of adults are estranged from at least one family member, and it's not just happening in silence. These experiences are becoming to be increasingly shared online. The rise in family estrangement directly correlates with more open discussion on social media platforms. For example, the hashtag toxic family has garnered over 1.9 billion views on TikTok. And that's not just a number, that is millions of people engaging with stories, reflections, and healing journeys that would have otherwise remained hidden. Platforms like TikTok and YouTube have created a space for people to realise, maybe for the first time, that what they experienced growing up wasn't normal or okay. This shift also aligns with wider cultural move towards recognising and prioritising mental health. People are actually learning that they're allowed to set boundaries, that it is okay to choose peace, even if it means going no contact with a parent or a family member. And for a lot of us, that is something that we didn't even know was an option until we saw somebody else speak it into the world. So if you're listening to this and you're feeling seen in anything that I've said, just know that there is a whole community of people out there having these exact conversations, and you are not alone in this. Just know that it's not just you, and it has never just been you. There is nothing wrong with needing to unpack it, grieve it, and unlearn what no longer serves you. I wanted to think a bit about how emotionally immature parenting has affected things like nursing, identity, and the future after my accident. Another place where I did notice these patterns showing up, both in a helpful and harmful way, was during my time as a mental health nurse. On one hand, nursing gave me a sense of purpose and structure. I remember being told during training that you're meant to leave your own shit at the door because your patients are your priority. And weirdly, I was pretty good at that, and I never quite understood why. People pleasing, putting everybody else's needs before mine. I'd been training for that my whole life without even knowing it, and I only had the realisation after being triggered by watching celebrity SAS that emotionally I was treated in the same way that these celebrities are put through their paces, especially in the house that I spent the majority of the time. I actually couldn't watch any more of it after the emotional wave that I had when I realised, and how horrible I felt for that. It was a sense of grief that I should have never been in that situation to start with. And I guess what I never really heard anyone talk about is how hard it is to pick all of that stuff back up when your shift ends. How disorientating it feels when you've spent all day supporting others but go home to your own emotionally heavy backpack that no one else can carry. I'd come home after shifts and struggle to decompress, struggle to settle. My brain was still in overdrive, and I was carrying all of these things I hadn't fully processed yet. Things that I didn't understand at the time. Trauma, complex family dynamics, burnout, people pleasing, things that I now have a better grasp on, but back then I just kept going because stopping felt scarier. And at times, I really did feel like there was no option. I was so far through uni and even further through life when I thought I would be dead, and it felt like I had no other choice but to just keep going. And sometimes I wonder, if I hadn't had the accident, would I have just kept carrying it all until I collapsed? Would I pushed and pushed until there was nothing left of me? And I now know that the accident did change something in me. Lying in the middle of that road and not knowing the extent of the damage and begging them not to call my mum, that was a moment of clarity, a line in the sand. And even if I'd woken up with lesser injuries, I think that that moment would have still stuck with me forever. It took something massive to shake me out of survival mode, and even then it just shook me into a whole different survival mode. But I needed that distance to start to heal. And through all of that healing that followed, the grief, the learning, the regaining of my autonomy, I realised that nursing had become my dream job because of my circumstances, because I wanted to fix a broken system. I wanted to be the nurse that truly saw people, and I now know that I was that, and I am so proud that I could have been. But I've also come to see nursing felt like trying to pour everything I had into a bottomless cup. I cared so deeply, but the system was bigger than me, and I could only help the people in front of me in that moment. And I'm starting to realise that maybe my passion for change, for justice, for supporting people might be better suited to advocacy. That idea both excites and terrifies me. The thought of maybe going back to university, of having to study law, of sitting the fucking bar, that is huge. But there's a whisper in the back of my mind that says, maybe, just maybe, this could be it. But I'm not rushing it. I'm not setting anything in stone. But I finally feel like I'm starting to figure out what is possible for the person I have become after the accident. And more importantly, I feel like I'm allowed to choose a future that suits who I am now and not who I had to be to survive or who others thought I should be. I am living to my own expectations and no one else's. Thinking about navigating distance and estrangement. Trying to create distance or even go no contact with emotionally immature parent is probably one of the hardest things that I've done, and I know that I'm not alone in that. One of the most common struggles is the guilt that comes up. Not just the guilt placed on you by family members, but the internalised guilt. The voice that says you're the bad one for walking away, that you're selfish, that you're giving up on your family, even if you've spent years trying to explain your feelings, expressing your boundaries, and make it work. The moment you take a step back, it can feel like you're a failure. Another huge challenge is the way that society sees family. There is this unspoken expectation that your family is everything, and that no matter how hurtful or damaging a relationship might be, you're meant to stick it out because they're your parents. But what if the very people who were supposed to protect you were the ones that made you feel unsafe in the first place? And that question haunts a lot of us, and the shame around even asking it can be totally paralysing. From my own experience, I really tried. I made the decision with my mum, and when she turned up at the hospital, I cried and I asked her to leave. And then I took time to send her a text explaining why I felt the way I did and why I wanted the distance. She said that she could hold her hands up, but at the end of the day, she was always my mum. And that was where I blocked her altogether, because over the past 3 years, when I had tried, she had not acted in a way that a mum would. And when it came to the start of last year, I poured my heart out. I explained myself calmly. I offered solutions, reflection, accountability, compromise, starting in conversations, sitting down that I had to record to avoid being gaslit and could properly take everything in. But it felt like after boundaries were crossed repeatedly, that low contact over email was a healthier way to communicate. But all it felt like I was doing was speaking into the void. Like every effort I made bounced off of a wall of defensiveness, minimising or blame shifting. And that kind of dynamic really makes you question your own reality. And I did start to question if I was overreacting or asking for too much, especially when one of the other closest people to me is telling me that my feelings are the problem and I just can't see it. Something I have learned is that emotionally immature people often react to boundaries with anger, not because you've done something wrong, but because they see your boundaries as rejection. Parents who lack emotional insight might be furious when their child creates distance, and they often can or won't see their role in what led to that decision. They may rewrite this story entirely, positioning themselves as the victim and their child as cruel, ungrateful, or unstable. And to that, I had to say, do you know what? Fine. I am fine being the villain in your story because I know for a fact that I did everything I possibly could. According to research by Dr. Joshua Coleman, a psychologist and author who specialises in family estrangement, 1 in 4 adults in the United States is currently estranged from a parent or child. This is a growing phenomenon, and part of that is because more people are finally giving themselves permission to walk away from the relationships that constantly hurt them. It doesn't mean they didn't try. In fact, most people who choose estrangement have made multiple attempts to repair the relationship before stepping away. And I want to emphasise very clearly that this decision is never taken lightly. It comes after years of questioning, trying, explaining, and really hoping that things will change. So when people say things like, life is too short, or you only get one mum or dad, it can feel like an absolute punch in the gut, as if we haven't already thought about those things, as if we didn't carry that weight every single day before choosing peace over proximity. I know life is short. I have faced that reality head on, and that is exactly why I had to protect my heart. That is why I made the painful decision to stop giving people the power to hurt me over and over again. So if you're someone who hears about someone else going no contact and your first instinct is to tell them to fix it, pause. Ask yourself if you know the full story, and if you don't, maybe the kindest, most supportive thing you can do is say nothing at all. Like the old saying goes, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And that's why I think that it is so powerful to end this episode by reminding you that some people have been able to navigate these situations in a way that has led to healing. There are families who have done the work, who have had the conversations, the hard ones, and they rebuilt something new. I saw it with my best friend, our dad kicking a lifelong amphetamine addiction because he knew if he didn't, he might lose his daughter forever. But unfortunately, there are also many who haven't. And for those people, space was a thing that finally allowed healing to begin. And it was not as a punishment, but this was a protection method. My conclusion and final thoughts. If you have been through something similar, I would love to hear your story, whether it ended with reconnection or acceptance with a distance. Your voice matters, and I do genuinely mean that. If you feel confident, leave your thoughts down below in the comments, and if not, and would just like to let your thoughts flow, you can always reach out to me at cripplecchroniclespod@gmail.com. I want to create a space for these kind of conversations because we're not meant to carry these experiences in silence. Today's episode has touched on a lot: what emotional immaturity can look like, how it shows up in families, and the long-term impact it can have on children well into adulthood, and what it means to start recognising those patterns for what they are. I've talked about the guilt, the grief, the hope, the deep sadness that can come with realising that maybe your parent isn't capable of meeting you where you are, no matter how much you wish they could. I've shared parts of my own journey, my time in nursing, and the accident that changed my life, and how those experiences helped me to begin to question and understand things I didn't have the language or tools to be able to do when I was younger. I also hope that sharing some of the social trends and research helped you to realise that if you've made the difficult choice to set boundaries or to go no contact, that you are far from alone. Whether your journey includes healing with your family or healing away from them, both paths are entirely valid and both require an insane amount of strength. Thank you for being here, for showing up, for listening, and for letting me to share something quite personal. If this episode has resonated with you in any way, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, or sharing it with someone who you think might be helpful to hear it. As always, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and you're always allowed to prioritise your peace. Until next time, bye!